I've always been a fan of solo hikes. There's something about being alone in the woods that feels freeing. Just me, my backpack, and miles of untouched wilderness. I thought I'd seen it all, well-marked trails, dense forests, hidden streams. But this hike was different, and not in the way I expected. It started as a spur-of-the-moment decision. My work had been piling up, and I needed an escape. A quick online search led me to a trail that wasn't too far from home but promised breathtaking views. It was a loop trail about 14 miles long with a few steep sections. The reviews said it wasn't for beginners, but I wasn't worried. I'd done longer and tougher hikes before. This one would be a breeze, or so I thought. I left early in the morning to make the most of the daylight. The parking lot was nearly empty when I arrived. A couple of cars were parked, their owners probably already deep into their hikes. The air was crisp, and the sky was clear. A perfect day for hiking. I grabbed my backpack, checked my water supply, and made sure I had my map, even though I knew the trail was supposed to be well marked. The first few miles were uneventful. The trail wound through a dense forest, the sunlight filtering through the trees in dappled patterns on the ground. I could hear birds chirping and the occasional rustle of leaves as squirrels darted around. The path was a mix of packed dirt and loose gravel, with a slight incline that made my calves burn just a little. As I walked, I fell into a rhythm. The crunch of my boots against the ground, the steady pace of my breathing. It all felt natural. Every now and then, I'd pause to take in the scenery or snap a photo. The forest was beautiful, the kind of place that felt untouched by time. About 4 miles in, the trail started to climb steeply. I stopped to take a sip of water and catch my breath. The incline wasn't overwhelming, but it was enough to remind me that I wasn't as fit as I used to be. I pushed on, the promise of a panoramic view at the summit keeping me motivated. When I reached the top, it was worth every step. The view was incredible. Rolling hills stretched out as far as I could see, blanketed in a mix of green and gold. A narrow stream snaked through the valley below, glinting in the sunlight. I sat down on a large, flat rock, pulled out a granola bar, and just sat there soaking it all in. I probably stayed longer than I should have. By the time I packed up and started heading down the other side of the loop, the sun had shifted. The light was softer now, casting long shadows across the trail. I didn't think much of it at the time. I had plenty of daylight left, or so I thought. The descent was steeper than the climb, and the trail was less defined. There were markers every so often, blue blazes painted on trees, but they were spaced farther apart. I had to stop a couple of times to make sure I was still on the right path. I started to notice how quiet it had gotten. The birdsong from earlier was gone, replaced by an unsettling stillness. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots and the occasional rustle of leaves. About halfway down, I realized I hadn't seen a trail marker in a while. I stopped and looked around, trying to spot the familiar blue blaze. Nothing. I walked back up a few yards, thinking I might have missed a turn, but the trail was just as unmarked in the other direction. A knot of unease settled in my stomach. I pulled out my map, but it wasn't much help. The trail wasn't detailed, just a general outline of the loop. I checked my phone, but there was no signal. That didn't surprise me. I hadn't expected to have service out here. Still, it was frustrating. I decided to keep moving forward. The trail had to pick up again eventually, right? I told myself not to panic. Getting turned around happens to hikers all the time. Stay calm, keep walking, and you'll find your way. But the farther I went, the less it felt like a trail. The ground was uneven, covered in roots and fallen branches. The trees grew closer together, their branches interlocking above me like a canopy. It was darker now, the sunlight barely reaching the forest floor. I stopped again to get my bearings. That's when I noticed the first sign that something was wrong. A tree ahead of me had deep gouges in its bark, as if something had clawed at it. The marks were fresh, the edges still raw. My heart started to race. Bears were known to frequent this area, but I'd never seen signs of one this close before. That I kept moving, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe it was just a wild boar or a raccoon. But the claw marks weren't the only thing. A few yards later, I found a patch of ground that had been disturbed, as if something had been digging. The soil was loose, scattered in every direction. My unease grew. I quickened my pace, no longer worried about finding the trail markers. I just wanted to get out of the forest. But the farther I went, the more lost I felt. Every direction looked the same: trees, shadows, and more trees. My water was running low, and my legs were starting to ache. I hadn't seen another person all day, and now, the solitude that had felt so freeing earlier was suffocating. As the light began to fade, I realized I had to make a decision. I could keep wandering, hoping to stumble across the trail, or I could stop and set up camp for the night. I had a small tent and a sleeping bag in my pack, along with enough food to last me until morning. The thought of staying in the woods overnight terrified me, but the idea of wandering in the dark was worse. I found a relatively flat spot beneath a large tree and started setting up camp. My hands were shaking as I pitched the tent. The sounds of the forest suddenly amplified in the growing darkness. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I crawled into the tent, zipped it up tight, and tried to calm my racing heart. I told myself I'd be fine. I'd wait until morning, retrace my steps, and find the trail. But sleep didn't come easily. Every sound outside felt like a threat, and my imagination ran wild. At some point, I must have drifted off, because I woke to the faint light of dawn filtering through the tent. The forest was quiet again, but the unease from the night before hadn't left me. I packed up quickly, eager to get moving. The morning light made it easier to navigate, and after a couple of hours, I finally stumbled back onto the trail. Relief washed over me as I saw the familiar blue blaze on a tree. I followed it back to the parking lot, my legs screaming in protest with every step. When I finally reached my car, I was exhausted, physically and mentally. I sat behind the wheel for a long time, just breathing, before starting the engine. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been lucky. The forest had tested me and I'd made it out, but I knew I'd never look at solo hikes the same way again. I was itching for a solo hike. My life had been feeling too scheduled lately. Work, home, repeat, and I craved something unplanned, raw, and untouched. Cedar Ridge, a sprawling trail system about 3 hours from where I lived, seemed perfect. It wasn't popular, which I liked. I wasn't interested in bumping into other hikers or hearing families shouting to each other. Cedar Ridge had steep climbs, thick forests, and an isolated reputation. That was what I needed. The forecast was clear. The air had that crisp late autumn bite to it, enough to wake you up but not enough to make you want to stay indoors. I packed lightly, bringing my tent, sleeping bag, some high-calorie food, and enough water for a day or two. I had a map printed from an outdated website and an old compass. Technology was overrated for trips like this, I told myself. A physical map felt more reliable. The drive to the trailhead was uneventful. I parked in a gravel lot that could fit maybe 6 cars. Mine was the only one there, which was both thrilling and a little unnerving. The air smelled clean, with a faint trace of pine and dry leaves. I shouldered my pack, checked the laces on my boots, and set off. The first few hours were uneventful. The trail wound through dense woods with trees towering on both sides. I followed the markers painted on tree trunks, occasionally pausing to compare them to my map. The trail climbed steadily, and my legs burned in the best way possible. Birds chirped in the canopy above, and the occasional squirrel darted across my path. It was peaceful, exactly what I wanted. After about 4 hours, I stopped for lunch. I found a flat rock overlooking a small stream and sat down. The water was clear, trickling softly over smooth stones. I ate a granola bar and some jerky, feeling the quiet settle into my bones. It was the kind of silence that reminded you how far from civilization you were. I kept going after lunch, but the trail grew rougher. The markers became less frequent, and the path was covered in fallen leaves, making it harder to tell where the trail ended and the forest floor began. I pulled out my map more often now, double-checking my position. The ridge loomed ahead, steep and imposing, but the view from the top was supposed to be worth it. By late afternoon, I reached the ridge. The climb had been brutal, loose rocks and sudden inclines, but when I got to the top, the view took my breath away. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, a sea of orange and brown under the fading light. The horizon was tinged with pink, and for a moment, I felt completely at peace. I pitched my tent a little below the ridge where the wind wasn't as strong. I cleared the ground of sticks and rocks, unrolled my sleeping bag, and settled in for the night. The temperature dropped quickly once the sun set, and I was grateful for my thermal layers. I ate a cold dinner, saving my stove fuel for breakfast. The quiet was different at night. During the day, there had been birds, wind, and my own footsteps. Now, there was nothing but the occasional rustle of leaves. I told myself it was just the wind, maybe a small animal. I read for a bit by the light of my headlamp and then forced myself to sleep. I woke up suddenly, unsure of what had disturbed me. My tent was pitch black except for a faint glow from the moon. I lay still, listening. First, I heard nothing. Then, faintly, there was a noise, a soft, rhythmic crunching, like footsteps on dry leaves. My heart thudded in my chest. I tried to tell myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the sound was too deliberate, too steady. It was coming from somewhere nearby, but I couldn't tell how close. I stayed still, barely breathing. The sound grew louder, closer. Whoever or whatever it was, they were moving slowly, deliberately. My mind raced. I was alone, miles from anyone, with no cell service. I had no weapon except for a small camping knife in my pack. The footsteps stopped right outside my tent. My pulse pounded in my ears, and I clenched my fists, unsure of what to do. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the sound moved away. The crunching grew fainter until it disappeared entirely. I didn't sleep after that. I lay awake, clutching my knife and straining to hear anything unusual. The forest was silent again, but my nerves were shot. When the first light of dawn crept through the trees, I packed up as quickly as I could. My hands shook as I rolled up my sleeping bag and stuffed it into my pack. I decided to cut my trip short and head back to the trailhead. I told myself it was just an animal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. As I retraced my steps, I noticed things I hadn't seen on the way up. A cigarette but near the trail, a crumpled candy wrapper, boot prints that weren't mine. The descent was faster, but the unease stayed with me. Every snap of a twig made me jump. I constantly glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something following me. When I finally reached the trailhead, my car was the only one there. I threw my pack into the trunk and locked the doors as soon as I got inside. My hands were still shaking as I started the engine. I never found out who or what was out there that night. Maybe it was just my imagination, heightened by the isolation. Or maybe someone was out there watching. Either way, it changed the way I hike. I still go out, but I stick to well-traveled trails now, and I always tell someone exactly where I'm going and when I'll be back. Somewhere deep in those woods, there's a part of me that stayed behind, a part that will always wonder what or who was walking outside my tent that night. It started as a plan to get away from everything for a few days. I had always loved hiking, and the idea of being alone in nature sounded perfect. I chose a trail in a remote area, one that wasn't very popular but promised beautiful views and a chance to disconnect. I packed enough food and water for 3 days, a map, a compass, a lightweight tent, and my trusted hiking boots. I felt prepared, maybe even over-prepared, but I didn't mind. The drive to the trailhead was long, winding, and increasingly remote. I passed fewer and fewer cars as the road narrowed and the trees closed in around me. By the time I parked, the sun was already high in the sky. The air was crisp and cool, and the forest smelled of pine and damp earth. I slung my pack over my shoulders and set off, feeling the familiar crunch of dirt and leaves under my boots. The first day was uneventful but beautiful. The trail wound through dense woods, occasionally opening up to reveal stunning views of the valley below. I stopped often to take it all in, snapping a few photos and enjoying the solitude. By late afternoon, I reached a small clearing near a stream, where I decided to set up camp for the night. After pitching my tent and eating a quick dinner, I sat by the stream for a while, letting the sound of running water soothe me. It was completely silent otherwise. No distant hum of cars, no voices, nothing. Just the wind in the trees and the occasional rustle of leaves. I went to bed feeling at peace, thinking this was exactly what I had needed. The second day started much like the first. I packed up and continued along the trail, which grew steeper as it climbed into the hills. The trees thinned out, giving way to rocky terrain. I was tired but exhilarated, pushing myself to keep going. By midday, I reached a ridge with a breathtaking view of the surrounding mountains. I sat there for a while, eating a granola bar and feeling a sense of accomplishment. It wasn't until I started descending the other side of the ridge that things began to feel off. The trail here was less defined, almost overgrown in places. I checked my map and compass, reassuring myself that I was still on track. The map showed the trail looping around a small lake before rejoining the main route back to the trailhead. It seemed straightforward enough. As the hours passed, the trail became harder to follow. Fallen trees blocked the path, and sections of it seemed to disappear entirely. I started to feel uneasy but convinced myself that it was just an old, lesser-used part of the trail. Still, I picked up my pace, hoping to reach the lake soon. By late afternoon, I realized I hadn't seen a trail marker in hours. The forest here was denser, darker, and eerily quiet. Even the birds seemed to avoid this area. I stopped to check my map again, but nothing looked right. I should have reached the lake by now. Panic began to creep in, but I forced myself to stay calm. I backtracked a bit, looking for any sign of the trail, but everything looked the same. As the sun dipped lower, I made the difficult decision to set up camp for the night. Wandering around in the dark would only make things worse. I found a relatively flat spot beneath a large tree and pitched my tent, though the thought of sleeping in such an unfamiliar place made my stomach churn. That night was the longest of my life. Every sound seemed amplified: the creak of branches, the rustle of leaves, the distant howl of an animal. I barely slept, jumping at every noise and straining to hear anything that might indicate another human presence. But there was nothing. When dawn finally broke, I felt a surge of determination. I had to find my way back. I packed up quickly and started walking, using my compass to head west, where I thought the main trail should be. The forest was a maze of identical trees and tangled underbrush, and every step felt like a battle against my growing panic. Hours turned into a blur. I rationed my water carefully, knowing I couldn't afford to run out. My food supply was dwindling, and the thought of being stuck out here for another night was unbearable. My legs ached, and my feet throbbed, but I pushed on, desperate to find anything that looked familiar. By late afternoon, I stumbled upon something that made my heart sink: a pile of stones arranged in a crude cairn. At first, I felt a flicker of hope, thinking it might be a marker for the trail. But as I got closer, I realized it was something else entirely. The stones were arranged in a way that felt deliberate, almost ritualistic. There was no logical reason for it to be here, in the middle of nowhere. I backed away quickly, my unease growing. My mind raced with questions: who had made it and why? But I had no time to dwell on it. The sun was sinking again, and I needed to find shelter. That night, I didn't set up my tent. I found a small overhang of rocks and huddled beneath it, too afraid to stay out in the open. My body ached from exhaustion, but my mind wouldn't let me rest. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig set my nerves on edge. The next morning, I woke to a cold, gray sky. My water was almost gone, and I knew I had to find a stream soon. I pressed on, my steps unsteady and my head pounding. Hours later, I heard the faint sound of running water and nearly cried with relief. The stream was shallow but clean, and I drank greedily before refilling my bottle. It gave me a brief moment of hope, but it didn't last long. As I followed the stream downhill, hoping it would lead me back to civilization, I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. A torn piece of fabric caught on a branch. It was unmistakably part of a hiking pack, weathered and frayed but recent enough to make my stomach churn. I searched the area but found nothing else. Whoever it belonged to was long gone, and the thought of meeting the same fate was too much to bear. I pushed myself harder, driven by sheer willpower and a primal need to survive. The stream eventually led me to a clearing, where I saw something that made my heart leap: a dirt road. It was overgrown and clearly unused, but it was a road nonetheless. I followed it for what felt like miles, my legs screaming in protest. Just as the sun began to set, I saw a small, dilapidated cabin in the distance. Smoke rose faintly from the chimney, and I nearly collapsed with relief. When I reached the cabin, I banged on the door, my voice hoarse from shouting for help. An older man opened it, his expression a mix of surprise and concern. He pulled me inside and gave me water and food, listening patiently as I tried to explain what had happened. It turned out I had wandered miles off the trail, far beyond the area marked on my map. The man offered to drive me to the nearest town the next morning, and I accepted without hesitation. That night, I slept in a real bed, the warmth of the fire chasing away the chill that had settled in my bones. The experience stayed with me long after I returned home. I learned a lot about myself on that hike, about my limits, my resilience, and the importance of preparation. But most of all, I learned to respect the wilderness and the quiet dangers it holds. I still love hiking, but I've never gone out alone again. I didn't plan for this trip to be a big adventure. It was just a simple idea that popped into my head one weekend when I had nothing to do. I live a quiet life, and the thought of heading into the woods alone for a few days seemed like the perfect escape. I chose a less popular trail in the mountains nearby, a place I'd heard about but never visited. It was supposed to be a moderate hike with some beautiful views. I packed my bag with the essentials: food, water, a small tent, sleeping bag, and a map of the area. I had my phone fully charged and carried a power bank just in case. The first day started beautifully. The air was crisp, the trees were alive with color, and the trail was well marked. I felt at ease as I walked along, the soft crunch of dirt and leaves under my boots the only sound apart from the occasional bird call. The path wound gently uphill, and I stopped now and then to take in the view. It felt good to be out there, away from everything. By late afternoon, I reached a small clearing where I decided to set up camp. It was a peaceful spot surrounded by tall pines, with just enough open space to see the sky. I pitched my tent and made myself a simple dinner on a portable stove. As the sun dipped lower, I settled in to enjoy the silence. The stars came out one by one, brighter than I'd seen in years. It was perfect. The trouble began the next day. I woke early, eager to cover more ground and maybe reach a small lake I'd seen on the map. It was supposed to be about 10 miles away, an easy distance for a day's hike. The trail became steeper as I went, the trees thicker. The sun filtered through in patches, and the air grew colder. Around midday, I noticed something odd. The trail markers, those small painted blazes on trees or rocks, had disappeared. I hadn't been paying much attention, confident that I was heading in the right direction. But when I stopped to look around, I realized I hadn't seen one in a while. At first, I wasn't worried. I had the map, after all. I spread it out on a flat rock and tried to figure out where I was. The problem was, the map wasn't detailed enough to show every twist and turn of the trail. It gave me a general idea, but not enough to pinpoint my exact location. I guessed I was still on the main path, even if the markers were sparse. I decided to keep going. By late afternoon, I knew I was lost. The trail had narrowed into something that didn't look like a trail at all, just a faint line through the underbrush. I doubled back, trying to find a familiar landmark, but everything looked the same. Tall trees, rocky ground, patches of moss. My phone's GPS was useless. I had no signal this deep in the mountains. I told myself not to panic. I had enough food and water for another day or two, and I could always retrace my steps to the clearing where I'd camped the night before. But as the hours passed and the light began to fade, the reality of my situation hit me. I was alone, miles from help, with no clear idea of how to get back. That night, I set up camp in a small hollow, trying to block the wind that had picked up. I barely slept. Every sound, a branch snapping, leaves rustling, seemed amplified in the darkness. I kept imagining wild animals lurking nearby, though I knew most were probably more scared of me than I was of them. Still, the fear gnawed at me, a constant weight in my chest. The next morning, I decided to try a different direction. I thought if I headed downhill, I might eventually find a stream or river. Water usually led to people, right? It seemed like a good plan, but the terrain was rougher than I expected. Steep slopes covered in loose rocks and tangled roots made every step a challenge. I slipped more than once, scraping my hands and knees. By midday, I found a small stream. Relief washed over me as I knelt to drink. The cold water tasted better than anything I'd ever had. I followed the stream for hours, hoping it would lead to a larger river or maybe even a road. But as the day wore on, the stream meandered aimlessly through dense forest, offering no sign of civilization. That evening, things took a darker turn. I noticed footprints along the muddy bank of the stream, not mine and not animal tracks either. They were human, but something about them didn't sit right. They were uneven, like whoever made them was limping or dragging one foot. The thought of someone else being out here should have been comforting, but it wasn't. Felt wrong. I decided not to follow the footprints and instead moved away from the stream to set up camp for the night. Sleep was impossible. I lay in my tent, every nerve on edge. The sounds of the forest seemed louder than before. Branches creaking, distant rustles in the underbrush. Around midnight, I heard something closer. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. They stopped just outside my tent. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. I didn't move, didn't breathe, hoping whoever or whatever it was would go away. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps retreated. I stayed awake until dawn, clutching the small camping knife I carried but never thought I'd need. The next morning, I packed up and moved quickly. I didn't care about the stream or finding a trail anymore. I just wanted to get out. The forest seemed endless, every direction the same. I stumbled through the underbrush, exhaustion making my legs feel like lead. Then I saw it, a rusted metal fence, barely visible through the trees. Hope surged in my chest. A fence meant people, maybe a farm or an old logging road. I followed it, though it was overgrown and difficult to navigate. After what felt like hours, I came to a gate. Beyond it was a dirt road. I nearly cried with relief. The road was rough and clearly not used often, but it had to lead somewhere. I followed it, my legs shaking with every step. Finally, just before sunset, I saw a small cabin in the distance. Smoke rose from the chimney, and a battered truck was parked outside. I didn't hesitate. I banged on the door, calling out for help. A man opened it, his face a mix of surprise and concern. He let me in, offered me water and a place to sit. I told him everything. How I'd gotten lost, the footprints, the footsteps outside my tent. He nodded but didn't say much. The man gave me a ride back to the nearest town the next morning. As we drove, he mentioned something that stuck with me. He said I wasn't the first hiker to get lost in those woods, and that not all of them were found. He didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask. When I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about the footprints by the stream and the footsteps outside my tent. I don't know who or what was out there with me, but I know I'll never go hiking alone again. Some places aren't meant to be explored. When I decided to hike through the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest, I thought I was prepared. My pack was loaded with everything I could think of: a sturdy tent, a sleeping bag rated for freezing temperatures, a week's worth of dehydrated meals, a water filter, a first aid kit, and a detailed topographic map. I'd been on plenty of hikes before, but this was going to be my first multi-day solo trek. I wanted to push myself and test my limits. What I didn't realize was just how quickly the wilderness can turn on you. The first day started out exactly as I had planned. I parked my car at a small trailhead just outside a town I'd never even heard of before finding it on a map. The air was crisp and cool, perfect for hiking. My boots crunched over fallen leaves as I made my way deeper into the forest. The trail was well marked at first, winding through towering firs and pines that blocked out most of the sunlight. It felt peaceful, almost too quiet, with only the occasional rustle of a squirrel or the chirp of a bird breaking the silence. By late afternoon, I'd covered about 10 miles and reached the spot I'd marked for my first campsite. It was a small clearing near a stream where I could refill my water bottles and set up my tent. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I sat by my little campfire, eating a simple meal of instant noodles and jerky. The stars were breathtaking, scattered like glitter across the inky black sky. I fell asleep that night feeling confident and excited for the days ahead. The second day was harder. The trail became less distinct, overgrown with brambles and patches of moss. I had to rely on my map more often, stopping every few minutes to check my bearings. The forest seemed denser, the trees pressing in on me from all sides. I noticed fewer signs of wildlife, which struck me as odd. By midday, I'd realized I wasn't making as much progress as I'd hoped. The terrain was more rugged than I'd anticipated, with steep inclines and rocky outcrops that slowed me down. Around mid-afternoon, I came across a fork in the trail that wasn't on my map. One path looked well-trodden, while the other was barely visible, overgrown with bushes and weeds. I debated for a long time, studying my map and compass, but I couldn't find any reference to the fork. Against my better judgment, I chose the overgrown path. I figured it might be a shortcut or an older section of the trail that wasn't marked. That decision was the first of many mistakes. The further I went, the harder it became to follow the path. It twisted and turned unpredictably, and before long, I wasn't even sure if I was on a trail anymore. I told myself it was fine, that I'd just backtrack if it led nowhere. But as the hours passed and the sun began to set, I realized I had no idea where I was. My map was useless, and the landmarks I saw didn't match anything I'd studied. Panic started to creep in, but I pushed it down. I found a small clearing and set up camp for the night, trying to convince myself that I'd figure it out in the morning. But sleep didn't come easily. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig outside my tent had me on edge. I felt exposed, vulnerable in a way I'd never experienced before. The next morning, I woke up to find the forest shrouded in a thick fog. Visibility was barely a few feet, and everything looked unfamiliar. I tried to retrace my steps, but the forest seemed to shift around me, twisting and turning into an endless maze of trees. My compass pointed north, but the terrain made it impossible to follow a straight line. I tripped over roots and stumbled through undergrowth, each step taking me deeper into uncertainty. By midday, I knew I was lost. I sat down on a fallen log to take stock of my situation. I had enough food for a few more days if I rationed it, and there was plenty of water around. But I had no way to signal for help. My phone had lost reception the moment I entered the forest. The only option was to keep moving and hope I stumbled onto a recognizable trail or a clearing where I could be spotted by a search party. As the hours dragged on, I began to feel the weight of isolation. The forest was silent, unnaturally so, as if it were holding its breath. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, though I never saw anyone or anything. That night, I barely slept. My small fire did little to keep the cold at bay, and every sound outside my tent made my heart race. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching through the underbrush. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the darkness, but there was nothing there. On the fourth day, I hit my breaking point. Exhaustion and hunger were taking their toll, and my legs felt like lead as I trudged through the forest. My thoughts were a jumbled mess of regret and fear. I cursed myself for coming out here alone, for taking that unmarked path, for not telling anyone exactly where I was going. Then, I found something that sent a chill down my spine, an old campsite. The fire pit was cold and overgrown with moss, and the remnants of a tent lay in shreds nearby. Rusted cans and faded wrappers were scattered around, as if whoever had been here left in a hurry. It wasn't recent, years, maybe even decades old, but it was a stark reminder of how unforgiving the wilderness could be. That night, I didn't bother setting up my tent. I sat by a small fire, clutching my knife and staring into the darkness. I felt completely alone, swallowed by the vastness of the forest. The fifth day brought a glimmer of hope. I stumbled across a stream and decided to follow it, remembering that water often leads to civilization. The going was slow, as I had to navigate around fallen trees and slippery rocks, but it was the first sense of direction I'd had in days. By late afternoon, I heard a sound that nearly brought me to tears, the distant hum of a motor. I scrambled up a ridge and saw a logging road cutting through the forest. It wasn't much, but it was a lifeline. I followed the road for hours, my legs aching with every step. Just as the sun was setting, I saw the faint glow of headlights in the distance. I waved my arms and shouted until the truck came to a stop. The driver, a grizzled old man, looked at me like I was a ghost. He gave me a ride back to the nearest town, where I learned that a search party had been organized after I failed to return on time. I was dehydrated, hungry, and covered in scratches, but I was alive. The experience changed me. I still love hiking, but I've never gone out alone again. The forest is beautiful, but it's also unforgiving, and it doesn't care about your plans or your confidence. I learned that the hard way, and I'll carry that lesson with me for the rest of my life. I had been planning this hike for weeks. It wasn't anything extreme, just a long day hike in a forest reserve a few hours from home. The trail, called Cedar Ridge Loop, was known for its challenging terrain and beautiful views. I'd done some hiking before, but this was supposed to be a step up, a chance to push myself a bit further. The forecast was perfect, clear skies and mild temperatures, and I had all my gear ready: water, snacks, a first aid kit, a fully charged phone, and even a printed map just in case my GPS failed. The drive to the trailhead was peaceful. The forest roads were quiet, and the occasional breaks in the trees revealed rolling hills covered in green. When I pulled into the small parking lot, there were only 2 other cars. I took a moment to double-check my gear and locked my car, feeling a mix of excitement and nervous energy. The trail began gently enough, a soft dirt path winding through tall pines and oaks. The air smelled clean and earthy, and the only sounds were the rustling leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. I kept a steady pace, enjoying the solitude. It felt good to be away from the noise of everyday life. About an hour in, the trail started to climb. It wasn't steep, but the incline was enough to make me feel it in my legs. I paused occasionally to catch my breath and sip water, using the breaks to take in the scenery. The trees thinned as I gained elevation, and patches of sunlight dappled the ground. The trail was well marked, with small signs nailed to trees every so often, reassuring me that I was on the right path. The first viewpoint was breathtaking. The trail opened up to a rocky outcrop overlooking a valley. The landscape stretched out before me, layers of green hills fading into the blue haze of the distance. I took a few photos and sat down to rest, munching on a granola bar. A light breeze cooled the sweat on my face, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. As I continued, the trail became rougher. Roots and rocks jutted out, forcing me to watch my footing carefully. The incline grew steeper, and I had to use my hands to steady myself in a few places. The trees were shorter here, and the undergrowth was thicker, making the path feel more enclosed. I'd been hiking for nearly 3 hours by now, and the exertion was starting to take its toll. My legs ached, and I was sweating more heavily, but I felt determined to complete the loop. Around midday, I reached the highest point of the trail. The view wasn't as open as the earlier overlook, but I could see glimpses of the valley through the trees. I took another break, refueling with some trail mix and more water. This was the halfway point, and from here, the trail was supposed to descend gradually back to the parking lot. That's when things started to feel off. The first sign was subtle, a strange stillness in the air. The breeze that had been constant earlier had disappeared, and the forest seemed unnaturally quiet. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just my imagination or a coincidence. But as I started the descent, the sense of unease grew. The trail seemed less defined here, the dirt path narrower and less worn. I checked the map and confirmed I was on the right route, but something about the surroundings felt unfamiliar. About 20 minutes later, I came across a fork in the trail. This wasn't marked on the map, and there were no signs indicating which path to take. I stood there for a moment, debating. The left path looked slightly more traveled, so I decided to follow it, hoping it would rejoin the main trail further down. The path became increasingly difficult to follow. Overgrown bushes and fallen branches obstructed the way, and I had to push through them, scratching my arms in the process. The ground was uneven, and I slipped a couple of times, catching myself on nearby trees. My unease deepened. I pulled out my phone to check my location, but the GPS signal was weak, and the map showed me in the middle of nowhere. I told myself to stay calm. I wasn't lost. I just needed to backtrack to the fork and try the other path. But when I turned around, I realized I wasn't entirely sure which way I'd come from. The overgrown vegetation made everything look the same, and I couldn't find any clear footprints or disturbances in the dirt. I felt a surge of panic, but forced myself to take deep breaths. I decided to keep moving, reasoning that I'd eventually intersect with the main trail or find a landmark. As I pressed on, the forest grew denser. The trees seemed to close in around me, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked out much of the sunlight. The air felt heavier, more humid, and I started to feel an uncomfortable tightness in my chest. My water supply was dwindling, and I realized I hadn't eaten much since the midpoint. Fatigue was setting in, making it harder to think clearly. After what felt like an eternity, I stumbled into a small clearing. In the center was an old, rusted metal drum, partially buried in the ground. It looked like it had been there for decades, covered in moss and surrounded by empty cans and broken glass. The sight was unsettling. Who had left this here and why? I didn't linger long, choosing a direction at random and continuing onward. The terrain became more treacherous. I found myself climbing over large rocks and navigating steep slopes. At one point, I slipped on loose gravel and landed hard on my side, scraping my arm and bruising my hip. The pain was sharp, but I could still move, so I pressed on. My heart was racing now, not just from exertion, but from the growing realization that I was in serious trouble. As the afternoon wore on, the light began to fade. The forest shadows grew longer, and the thought of being stuck out here after dark filled me with dread. I'd left my headlamp in the car, assuming I'd be back before sunset. My phone battery was at 20%, and I needed to conserve it in case I had to call for help. But with no signal, that option felt increasingly unlikely. I tried shouting for help, my voice echoing weakly in the dense forest. There was no response. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant crack of a branch. Each sound made my heart jump, but I never saw anything. The isolation was overwhelming. Eventually, I found a small stream trickling through the rocks. Relief washed over me as I knelt to refill my water bottle, using a portable filter I'd brought along. The cold water revived me slightly, and I decided to follow the stream downhill, hoping it would lead to a larger water source or, ideally, civilization. The stream's path was rough, filled with slippery rocks and thick undergrowth. I slipped several times, soaking my shoes and socks. My feet were blistered, and every step became a struggle. But I kept moving, driven by the faint hope that I'd find a way out. As the last light of day faded, I came across something that made my stomach drop. A tattered piece of fabric caught on a branch. It looked like it had been part of a backpack or jacket, faded and weathered by the elements. Nearby, I spotted an old boot, its sole peeling away. The sight filled me with a sickening mix of fear and determination. Someone else had been here, and they hadn't made it out. I refused to let that be my fate. Night fell quickly, and I was plunged into darkness. The moonlight barely penetrated the thick canopy, and I had to use my phone's flashlight sparingly. Every shadow seemed to move, and every sound set my nerves on edge. My progress slowed to a crawl as I tried to avoid tripping or walking into low-hanging branches. I was exhausted, hungry, and on the verge of despair. Just when I thought I couldn't go on, I heard it, the faint hum of a motor. My heart leapt as I strained to pinpoint the direction of the sound. It was coming from ahead, and I forced myself to move faster, stumbling through the undergrowth. The sound grew louder, and soon I saw a faint light flickering through the trees. I burst out of the forest onto a gravel road. A small utility truck was parked a few yards away, its headlights illuminating a worker repairing a downed power line. I called out, my voice hoarse and shaking. The worker turned, startled, and quickly came to help me. Tears streamed down my face as I explained what had happened. He radioed for assistance, and within an hour, I was safe in the back of a rescue vehicle, wrapped in a blanket and sipping warm tea. The experience left me shaken but grateful. I'd made mistakes, taking the wrong path, underestimating the trail's difficulty, but I'd also persevered. The forest had tested me in ways I'd never imagined, but it hadn't beaten me. As I sat in the rescue vehicle, watching the dark trees recede into the distance, I vowed to learn from this and be better prepared for my next adventure. The trail stretched out in front of me, twisting and turning like a ribbon through the dense forest. I had been planning this solo hike for weeks. The thought of escaping the endless hum of the city and immersing myself in nature, just me and the wilderness, was too tempting to pass up. It was early fall, and the leaves were painted in fiery reds and golden yellows. The air was crisp, carrying that earthy scent of decaying leaves, damp wood, and the faint musk of pine. The hike wasn't supposed to be too challenging. It was about 10 miles round trip to a remote overlook I'd read about online. The reviews called it breathtaking, secluded, and worth every step. That was exactly what I wanted. I double-checked my gear: water, a packed lunch, a map and compass, my phone, a small first aid kit, a flashlight, and a knife. I felt prepared. The first few miles were peaceful. The crunch of my boots on the dirt trail, the occasional rustle of a squirrel darting through the underbrush, and the distant chirping of birds were the only sounds. It felt good to be alone with my thoughts. I hadn't seen anyone else on the trail, which didn't surprise me. It was a weekday, and this wasn't a popular tourist spot. About halfway in, the forest started to change. The trail grew narrower, the trees seemed closer together, and the sunlight struggled to penetrate the thick canopy. The air felt colder, though I hadn't climbed much higher. The silence was what struck me most. It was as if the forest had swallowed all sound. No birds, no squirrels, not even the whisper of wind through the leaves. Just the steady rhythm of my breathing and the thud of my boots. I pushed on, brushing off the unease as nerves. It's just your mind playing tricks on you, I told myself. You're alone in the woods, and it's quiet. That's all. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Every so often, I'd catch a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there, just trees and shadows. I stopped for a break around mile 4. The trail had started to climb more steeply, and I was sweating despite the chill. I found a flat rock by the side of the trail and sat down, taking a long drink of water and munching on a granola bar. The forest around me was still and silent. Too silent. It was unnatural, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. As I sat there, I thought I heard a sound, faint, almost imperceptible, a rhythmic crunching, like footsteps on leaves. It was coming from behind me, farther down the trail. My heart skipped. I turned, scanning the trail and the woods beyond. Nothing, just trees and shadows. I waited, holding my breath, but the sound didn't come again. Maybe it was an animal, I thought, trying to calm myself. A deer or something. But deep down, I didn't believe it. I decided to keep moving. The faster I got to the overlook, the sooner I could take a break and head back. As I hiked, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I'd never felt anything like it before. It wasn't just paranoia. It was a primal, gut-deep sensation, like an alarm going off in the back of my mind. Something's wrong. Something's not right. About a mile from the overlook, the trail started to level out. The trees thinned slightly, letting more light through. I felt a small wave of relief. The forest didn't feel as oppressive here. But that's when I saw it. A shoe. It was lying just off the trail, half hidden under a pile of leaves. A single hiking boot, scuffed and dirty. My first thought was that someone had lost it, but as I stepped closer, I saw that it wasn't just a shoe. There was a sock inside it, and the sock was stained dark red. I froze. My brain tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Maybe it's a prank, I thought, or maybe someone got hurt and lost their shoe. But the logical part of me knew better. The shoe didn't look like it had been there long. The leaves around it were undisturbed, and the blood on the sock hadn't dried completely. I looked around, scanning the forest. The shadows between the trees seemed darker now, and every rustle of leaves made me jump. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, to get out of there, but I hesitated. What if someone was hurt? What if they needed help? I took a deep breath and stepped off the trail, moving cautiously toward the shoe. The ground was uneven, covered in roots and fallen branches. I scanned the area, looking for any sign of a person. That's when I saw the drag marks. They were faint but unmistakable. A line in the dirt and leaves, as if something heavy had been pulled through the forest. The marks led deeper into the woods, away from the trail. I stood there, torn. Every instinct told me to leave, to run back the way I came. But what if someone was out there, injured and unable to move? I couldn't just leave them. I pulled out my knife and flashlight, gripping both tightly as I followed the marks. The further I went, the darker it seemed to get. The trees closed in around me, and the air grew colder. The drag marks were clearer now, cutting a path through the underbrush. My heart pounded in my chest, every nerve on edge. The forest was silent, but the silence was oppressive, heavy, felt alive. After what felt like an eternity, I saw something up ahead. At first, I thought it was a fallen tree, but as I got closer, I realized it was a tarp. A dirty, crumpled tarp, partially hidden under a pile of leaves. My mouth went dry. I didn't want to see what was under it, but I couldn't stop myself. Slowly, I reached out with the tip of my knife and lifted the edge. The smell hit me first, a sickly, metallic stench that made my stomach churn. Beneath the tarp was a bundle of clothes, a backpack, and what looked like bones. Human bones. My brain refused to process what I was seeing. This can't be real, I thought. This doesn't happen. Not here. I stumbled back, my hands shaking. I had to get out of there. I turned and started running, not caring about the noise I made. The trail seemed impossibly far away. Every shadow, every rustle of leaves felt like a threat. I'd lost all sense of direction, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away. As I ran, I thought I heard something behind me. Footsteps, fast and heavy, crashing through the underbrush. I didn't dare look back. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like jelly, but I kept going. The trail had to be close. It had to be. Finally, I burst out onto the trail. Relief flooded through me, but it was short-lived. The footsteps were still behind me, closer now. I ran as fast as I could, my mind racing. Who was it? What did they want? My only thought was to get back to my car. The parking lot came into view, and I've never felt such overwhelming relief. I sprinted to my car, fumbling with my keys. My hands were shaking so badly that I dropped them. I could hear the footsteps behind me, closer and closer. Finally, I managed to unlock the door and threw myself inside, slamming the door shut and locking it. I sat there, panting, my heart pounding in my chest. I expected to see someone emerge from the trail, but no one came. The forest was still and silent again, as if nothing had happened. I didn't wait. I started the car and drove away, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly they ached. I reported what I'd found to the authorities. They took my statement, but I never heard back about what they discovered, if anything. I've replayed that day in my mind 1,000 times, trying to make sense of it. I don't know who or what was out there in the woods, and I'm not sure I want to. What I do know is this: I'll never hike alone again. The trail stretched out in front of me, twisting and turning like a ribbon through the dense forest. I had been planning this solo hike for weeks. The thought of escaping the endless hum of the city and immersing myself in nature, just me and the wilderness, was too tempting to pass up. It was early fall, and the leaves were painted in fiery reds and golden yellows. The air was crisp, carrying that earthy scent of decaying leaves, damp wood, and the faint musk of pine. The hike wasn't supposed to be too challenging. It was about 10 miles round trip to a remote overlook I'd read about online. The reviews called it breathtaking, secluded, and worth every step. That was exactly what I wanted. I double-checked my gear: water, a packed lunch, a map and compass, my phone, a small first aid kit, a flashlight, and a knife. I felt prepared. The first few miles were peaceful. The crunch of my boots on the dirt trail, the occasional rustle of a squirrel darting through the underbrush, and the distant chirping of birds were the only sounds. It felt good to be alone with my thoughts. I hadn't seen anyone else on the trail, which didn't surprise me. It was a weekday, and this wasn't a popular tourist spot. About halfway in, the forest started to change. The trail grew narrower, the trees seemed closer together, and the sunlight struggled to penetrate the thick canopy. The air felt colder, though I hadn't climbed much higher. The silence was what struck me most. It was as if the forest had swallowed all sound. No birds, no squirrels, not even the whisper of wind through the leaves. Just the steady rhythm of my breathing and the thud of my boots. I pushed on, brushing off the unease as nerves. It's just your mind playing tricks on you, I told myself. You're alone in the woods, and it's quiet. That's all. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Every so often, I'd catch a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there, just trees and shadows. I stopped for a break around mile 4. The trail had started to climb more steeply, and I was sweating despite the chill. I found a flat rock by the side of the trail and sat down, taking a long drink of water and munching on a granola bar. The forest around me was still and silent, too silent. It was unnatural, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. As I sat there, I thought I heard a sound, faint, almost imperceptible, a rhythmic crunching, like footsteps on leaves. It was coming from behind me, farther down the trail. My heart skipped. I turned, scanning the trail and the woods beyond. Nothing, just trees and shadows. I waited, holding my breath, but the sound didn't come again. Maybe it was an animal, I thought, trying to calm myself, a deer or something, but deep down I didn't believe it. I decided to keep moving. The faster I got to the overlook, the sooner I could take a break and head back. As I hiked, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I'd never felt anything like it before. It wasn't just paranoia. It was a primal, gut-deep sensation, like an alarm going off in the back of my mind. Something's wrong. Something's not right. About a mile from the overlook, the trail started to level out. The trees thinned slightly, letting more light through. I felt a small wave of relief. The forest didn't feel as oppressive here, but that's when I saw it. A shoe. It was lying just off the trail, half hidden under a pile of leaves. A single hiking boot, scuffed and dirty. My first thought was that someone had lost it, but as I stepped closer, I saw that it wasn't just a shoe. There was a sock inside it, and the sock was stained dark red. I froze. My brain tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Maybe it's a prank, I thought, or maybe someone got hurt and lost their shoe. But the logical part of me knew better. The shoe didn't look like it had been there long. The leaves around it were undisturbed, and the blood on the sock hadn't dried completely. I looked around, scanning the forest. The shadows between the trees seemed darker now, and every rustle of leaves made me jump. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, to get out of there, but I hesitated. What if someone was hurt? What if they needed help? I took a deep breath and stepped off the trail, moving cautiously toward the shoe. The ground was uneven, covered in roots and fallen branches. I scanned the area, looking for any sign of a person. That's when I saw the drag marks. They were faint but unmistakable. A line in the dirt and leaves, as if something heavy had been pulled through the forest. The marks led deeper into the woods, away from the trail. I stood there, torn. Every instinct told me to leave, to run back the way I came. But what if someone was out there, injured and unable to move? I couldn't just leave them. I pulled out my knife and flashlight, gripping both tightly as I followed the marks. The further I went, the darker it seemed to get. The trees closed in around me, and the air grew colder. The drag marks were clearer now, cutting a path through the underbrush. My heart pounded in my chest, every nerve on edge. The forest was silent, but the silence was oppressive, heavy, felt alive. After what felt like an eternity, I saw something up ahead. At first, I thought it was a fallen tree, but as I got closer, I realized it was a tarp. A dirty, crumpled tarp, partially hidden under a pile of leaves. My mouth went dry. I didn't want to see what was under it, but I couldn't stop myself. Slowly, I reached out with the tip of my knife and lifted the edge. The smell hit me first, a sickly, metallic stench that made my stomach churn. Beneath the tarp was a bundle of clothes, a backpack, and what looked like bones. Human bones. My brain refused to process what I was seeing. This can't be real, I thought. This doesn't happen. Not here. I stumbled back, my hands shaking. I had to get out of there. I turned and started running, not caring about the noise I made. The trail seemed impossibly far away. Every shadow, every rustle of leaves felt like a threat. I'd lost all sense of direction, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away. As I ran, I thought I heard something behind me. Footsteps, fast and heavy, crashing through the underbrush. I didn't dare look back. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like jelly, but I kept going. The trail had to be close. It had to be. Finally, I burst out onto the trail. Relief flooded through me, but it was short-lived. The footsteps were still behind me, closer now. I ran as fast as I could, my mind racing. Who was it? What did they want? My only thought was to get back to my car. The parking lot came into view, and I've never felt such overwhelming relief. I sprinted to my car, fumbling with my keys. My hands were shaking so badly that I dropped them. I could hear the footsteps behind me, closer and closer. Finally, I managed to unlock the door and threw myself inside, slamming the door shut and locking it. I sat there, panting, my heart pounding in my chest. I expected to see someone emerge from the trail, but no one came. The forest was still and silent again, as if nothing had happened. I didn't wait. I started the car and drove away, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly they ached. I reported what I'd found to the authorities. They took my statement, but I never heard back about what they discovered, if anything. I've replayed that day in my mind 1,000 times, trying to make sense of it. I don't know who or what was out there in the woods, and I'm not sure I want to. What I do know is this: I'll never hike alone again. The air was crisp as I tightened the straps on my backpack and took my first step onto the rugged trail. The morning sun was just beginning to crest over the mountains, casting long shadows across the dense forest that surrounded me. I'd planned this solo hike for weeks, mapping out a remote route through the national forest. It wasn't my first hike alone, but it was certainly the most ambitious. My goal was to complete a 15-mile loop, camping overnight at a secluded spot marked by a small lake. The trailhead was quiet, just the sound of my boots crunching against the dirt and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. As I walked, the forest seemed to come alive. Birds chirped overhead, and squirrels darted across the path. I felt the weight of my gear settle comfortably on my shoulders. It was one of those moments where everything seemed right, where the worries of everyday life melted away. The first few miles were uneventful. The trail wound through thick stands of pine and fir, the air filled with their sharp, resinous scent. I passed a few other hikers, exchanging brief nods and smiles but keeping to myself. By midday, the sun was high and the temperature had risen. I stopped near a small creek to refill my water bottle and eat a quick lunch. The cool, clear water tasted like heaven after the steady uphill climb. After lunch, the trail became steeper and less defined. The forest grew denser, the trees taller and more imposing. I noticed fewer signs of human activity. No footprints, no discarded wrappers, not even the faintest trace of a trail marker. But I wasn't concerned. I had my map, compass, and GPS, and I'd studied the route extensively. Still, there was a sense of isolation that began to creep in, a subtle reminder that I was miles away from the nearest road or town. By late afternoon, I reached the ridge that marked the halfway point of the loop. The view was breathtaking. Rolling hills stretched out as far as the eye could see, blanketed in a sea of green. I paused to take it all in, snapping a few photos with my phone. The wind was stronger up here, carrying a slight chill despite the warm day. I pulled on my jacket and began the descent toward the lake where I planned to camp. The trail down was rougher than I'd anticipated. Loose rocks and exposed roots made footing treacherous. At one point, I slipped and landed hard on my side, scraping my hand on the jagged ground. I cursed under my breath, brushing the dirt off and checking my gear for damage. My water bottle had taken the brunt of the fall, its surface scuffed but still intact. Shaking it off, I pressed on, more cautious now with each step. As the sun dipped lower, the forest grew darker, shadows stretching like fingers across the trail. I reached the lake just as the last light was fading. It was smaller than I'd imagined, more of a large pond than a true lake, but it was beautiful in its solitude. The water was still, reflecting the darkening sky like a mirror. I set up my tent a few yards from the shore, gathering some fallen branches to build a small fire. The fire crackled softly as I cooked a simple dinner of instant noodles and jerky. The warmth was comforting against the encroaching cold. I sat there for a while, staring into the flames, listening to the sounds of the night. The occasional hoot of an owl or the distant snap of a twig reminded me I wasn't entirely alone out here, though I hadn't seen another person since midday. I crawled into my tent, zipping myself into my sleeping bag. The ground was hard and uneven, but exhaustion quickly overtook me. I drifted off to sleep, lulled by the rhythmic chirping of crickets. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure what had roused me. The fire had long since burned out, leaving the campsite in near total darkness. I lay still, listening. The forest was quiet, too quiet. The usual nighttime symphony of insects and frogs was absent. I felt a prickle of unease, but told myself it was nothing. Maybe a predator was nearby, scaring off the smaller animals. It wasn't uncommon in these parts. I tried to go back to sleep, but a faint noise caught my attention. A soft, rhythmic crunching, like footsteps on dry leaves. My heart began to race. Could be a deer or some other animal, I reasoned. But the sound was deliberate, steady, and unmistakably human. I held my breath, straining to hear more. The footsteps stopped, then started again, closer this time. I'd never felt so vulnerable. My mind raced with possibilities. Could it be another hiker? Unlikely, given how remote this area was. Poacher? A lost traveler? Or something more sinister? I reached for the small knife I kept in my backpack, gripping it tightly. My hand trembled, but I forced myself to stay calm. The footsteps stopped again, just outside the tent. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure whoever was out there could hear it. I waited, every muscle in my body tense. Then, as suddenly as they'd started, the footsteps retreated, fading into the distance. I stayed awake the rest of the night, clutching the knife and listening for any sign of the intruder. When dawn finally broke, I emerged from the tent, my eyes scanning the area. There were no signs of anyone, no footprints, no discarded items, nothing. It was as if I'd imagined the whole thing, but I knew what I'd heard. Unease settled deep in my gut, and I decided to cut my trip short. The remaining miles of the loop didn't seem so appealing anymore. Packing up my gear, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone watching me. The hike back to the trailhead was grueling. Every sound, a snapping branch, a rustling bush, set my nerves on edge. I moved as quickly as I could, barely stopping to catch my breath. When I finally reached the parking lot, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. My car was right where I'd left it, and there were no signs of tampering. I threw my backpack into the trunk and climbed into the driver's seat, locking the doors immediately. My hands shook as I started the engine. As I drove away, the forest seemed to close in behind me, swallowing the trail and its secrets. I've thought about that night countless times since. I've tried to rationalize it, to come up with a plausible explanation. But the truth is, I don't know who or what was out there. All I know is that I'll think twice before hiking alone again.